I'm Ken Jacobson, one of the programmers for DocLands, and I want to welcome you to DocLands and to this Q&A for The Infinite Race, directed by Bernardo Ruiz. First, I want to thank our supporters of the festival, our sponsors, our California Film Institute members, and of course, you, our audience. Now on to the film. The Infinite Race had its world premiere at this year's Full Frame Film Festival, and we're thrilled to present it here as part of this year's DocLands. We're equally thrilled to have with us today director Bernardo Ruiz. Bernardo Ruiz is a two-time Emmy Award-nominated documentary filmmaker and a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. His directorial feature debut, Reportero, about attacks on the press in Mexico, also premiered at Full Frame. His second feature documentary, Kingdom of Shadows, premiered in the United States at South by Southwest. And his feature documentary, Harvest Season, which hopefully some of you have had a chance to see, had its world premiere at the 2018 Mill Valley Film Festival. In the fall of 2015, Bernardo was a filmmaker in residence at the Investigative Reporting Program at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome, Bernardo. Congratulations on the film, and thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be here and great to talk with you, Ken, even if it's via Zoom. I'd rather do this in person, but it's nice to be able to do this at all. So,
me too, and hopefully your next film will be at Mill Valley or DocLands, and we'll be able to have you in person. So The Infinite Race is, it's a really richly layered film, and I want to get to that in a moment, but I first want to just ask you about the genesis of the project. How did you first learn of the Tarahumara people and this ultra marathon, the Caballo Blanco?
So it's a great question because it's a story with a lot of elements, but I had actually been in touch with the team from 30 for 30, the ESPN series, about another project, about potentially doing a boxing project. And, one of the things I've always loved about their series is that they'll take a story that's, superficially about sports, but the filmmakers inevitably, and they're really encouraged by the 30 for 30 team to kind of unpack the sports story and dig into those layers. So whether you're talking about race in America or class or, the power of celebrity or, any one of these themes, the films inevitably go deeper. So the boxing project that we've been talking about fell to the wayside, but Elizabeth Geist, who's the executive there, she sent me this incredible piece of investigative reporting by a journalist named Ryan Goldberg. He wrote this Texas Monthly piece called The Drug Runners. And it's basically a piece about how the Tarahumara, or they refer to themselves as Raramuri, how they have been in certain circumstances conscripted by organized crime groups, by cartels in Mexico to ferry drugs into the United States. And so we began a conversation about what a film around this topic would look like and how we could make something like this work. The other kind of big force or big pull is Christopher McDougall's bestseller, Born to Run. So, that book came out just over a decade ago. It was 2009 when the book hit. Even I, who I'm not a runner or not a real runner, I heard about people running barefoot and the kind of minimalist footwear craze that book really kind of sparked. So there were these just kind of two forces. And that was really the genesis of the film was, how this article in this book, and this kind of thought about, what happens when a book or a movie or a story has a big impact on a community that often doesn't get a lot of attention.
And when did you start shooting, and when was the end of production, just to give us a sense of your production timeline? So
let's see now, it's kind of hard to remember anything before the pandemic. We were in production for most of 2019, in the beginning of 2019. So the Ultra Marathon, which is this 80-kilometer, 50-mile race, that was in March of last year. Hard to believe. So that was really our kind of introduction as a production team. And I really worked with an amazing production team to shoot in 2019, including Victor Tadashi Suarez, the cinematographer that I had worked with on Harvest Season.
So one of the great things about the film is that it's such a rich tapestry of people. There's Silvino Kubasara, who's the runner, the Tarahumara runner who we meet at the beginning. There's Micah True, who we meet, Luis Escobar, who was a photographer and runner from way back at the beginning of the history of that race. And then there are these other amazing people, Irma Chavez, Catalina Rascon, who's the young runner, as well as, other folks who we meet through the course of the film. All of these people, add real richness to the film, but they also add layers of narratives that kind of recontextualize how we view what's going on as the film is progressing. When did you figure out that the key to this film was to weave together, a fabric of all these different characters and their stories?
I really appreciate that question, Ken. I think I have a challenging tendency as a filmmaker to want to move in and out of stories and in and out of voices. So, I love Robert Altman's films. I love those films that kind of give you a sense of place and of a world, a very specific world, whether it's Nashville or even, I'm not in any way comparing myself to Juan de Cobra, but something like Battle of Algiers, just the idea that what happens to a story when you have little glimpses of voices. So rather than a very, very straightforward kind of, protagonist journey or hero journey, what I'm interested in those kind of fragment stories. Now, sometimes I think that can get challenging. It's challenging in the edit, and it can be challenging for an audience sometimes. But I think in this case, it sort of was a situation where I felt like that style or that goal matched the material, because there are so many perspectives and so many layers. And so, ultimately, I thought what was interesting is it's about this space. This film is really about the space where, white North American runners and indigenous runners kind of meet and how they negotiate each other. Some people with really good intentions, maybe other people who, don't have the best intentions, but what happens when all of these people come together? And I feel like the only way to understand that is through this kind of chorus of voices.
Yeah, I want to get back to that, but in a second. But I also want to go back to something you touched on a few minutes ago, which was the book Born to Run. How much did you know about this book before you started, and its influence on the race and the local region? And did your thoughts kind of evolve over time about the book and its author, as Christopher McDougall, as you delve deeper into your story? I think there's a good amount of healthy skepticism conveyed throughout the film about the book, but I would also say you kind of leave it to the viewer to decide what to think as well. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
So I had heard about the book when it came out, and was, I remember in the years after the book came out, there was, HBO Sports did packages on the barefoot running craze and some of the claims that Christopher McDougall was making in the book about the health benefits of running barefoot. The New York Times did pieces on the barefoot running craze. So I was kind of vaguely aware of it, but, I have to confess, it wasn't where my focus was at the time. But when we started this project in earnest, of course, picked up the book and read it a few times, and it's a very entertaining page turner. It's a good read. I get why it became a bestseller. It's also been optioned multiple times. It's my understanding it's been optioned multiple times by by actors and production companies, because there's a good kind of adventure story there. But I think I was more interested in the book for what it did than the book for like the content or the substance of the book. I was more interested in the kind of impact that this book had on this community. So, knowing what I know about small towns in Mexico and rural Mexico that are, pretty disconnected from big media, from the HBOs, the New York Timeses of the world, the most interesting thing to me and my team was how did this, book that was on the bestseller list, how did it impact the, people who live day in and day out in this place? And that was kind of our starting point. So, I'd say it's like less as a criticism of the book and more of an interest in looking at it as a phenomenon, like the shadow that the book cast over this town.
In some ways, the film is a cautionary tale, and I would say one of those tales is, about good intentions and how good intentions can have unintended consequences. And related to that is it's a cautionary tale, I think, of cultural appropriation. And as I was watching it again, I was thinking, is there kind of an alternate history that could have been written, perhaps one in which, the indigenous people were given more ownership over the race from the beginning, perhaps, or certainly were given more of a say in how it was run and how it evolved. Luis says at one point, Micah wanted to help them. We all wanted to help them, but who are we to help them? And I'm would love to get your take about issues of cultural appropriation and really the power dynamic.
So I really appreciate that question. It's a really thoughtful question. And I think it's a question that's kind of perfect for this moment, because certainly in our world, in the film world, there are really vigorous debates happening right now about who gets to tell what story, whoever's behind the camera, that it matters, and that, whoever's driving the story, that we need to have better representation and some nuance there. And so I think that, it's a really pertinent question. I think in this film, what we were trying to do and most interested in is the kind of weird interactions, the kind of awkward interactions that happen, and how people negotiate power, and what happens when people come together. The race, the Ultra Maratón Caballo Blanco, couldn't have come from a better place. Micah True had this goal of bringing attention and, hopefully some resources to a very under-resourced area, a very poor area. But inevitably, good consequences come. Other things follow when you have good intentions, rather. And so I think it's kind of a story about what happens when wealthier countries bring in aid to poorer countries. I think there's maybe a metaphor in there for that as well. So do I think that, yes, do I think that there was a way in which maybe a kind of a book about that race and about this community could have been done in a different way? I do. I think for me, when you compare the Texas Monthly article by Ryan Goldberg and Born to Run, they're kind of doing very different things. Born to Run is kind of a romantic fable. It's an entertaining page turner, but I think maybe misses some important journalistic detail. Whereas I think Ryan Goldberg's piece it's a tougher piece, but I think touches on some very important realities that the Tarahumara face. So I think there is a way in which that story could have been written in a different way. But at the end of the day, and what we wanted to do in the film was look at what happens when those kind of two worlds collide.
Mm-hmm. A small thing in the film, but something that I think is really important are the sandals, that are worn, made and worn by the Tarahumara. Can you talk a bit about the sandals and just the tradition of making them, and just kind of your exposure to the Sandals as you were filming the project.
So, both in Mexico and outside of Mexico, it's usually the one thing people know about the Tarahumara is that they either run barefoot or with these homemade sandals. And I think it's worth noting because, Chihuahua, the state where the Tarahumara primarily reside, it's the largest state in Mexico, and it's has these canyons, the Copper Canyons, and it's very hard kind of scrabble terrain. So it's particularly notable that runners are racing in either barefoot or in sandals. It's tough terrain by anyone's standard. But there isn't a lot of knowledge kind of beyond that about the Tarahumara. So even within Mexico, there's a lot of romanticization and folklorization, of this group within Mexico. So I don't think it's just, North Americans who don't have an understanding of the group. It's just, it's been an isolated community, and I think, many Mexicans don't know. But this tradition, there are a lot of thoughts and theories about this tradition of running. I think for the purposes of our film, I really relied on Irma Chavez, who was an activist and a runner herself. And I think she makes a lot of really important points in the film. And one of them is that, she and Silvino both say it, but that people run this way out of necessity, that it's a kind of product of poverty and the kind of creativity or, the kind of necessity that breeds a certain kind of creativity. So, the sandals are typically made from tire treads, string or rope or leather, if you can get a hold of leather. But also a lot of people do run barefoot. And the point she makes in the film is that, people do this out of necessity, and that, Silvino is the one who kind of laughs at the idea of wealthy Americans in a far off New York running barefoot through Central Park. And he explains, we do this because we have to. If we could, we would buy shoes or sneakers.
Yeah, I love that scene, and just his reaction to watching that kind of says so much. I wanted to ask you about the kind of, there's a point, I think is it 2015, where, the race doesn't happen because of, violence or the threat of violence or the fear of violence in the town. And that's when we kind of learn about Josue Stevens and Maria Walton, and, it's interesting. And the film kind of takes another turn because we also meet Cecilia, who's, the director of tourism for the town. And again, it's kind of a complicated power dynamic, one that seems like it was working until it wasn't working rather spectacularly. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you learned about as you were researching the film. How did you come to their story and, learn about all these complexities about that specific race? And then also how that race seems to have changed what the race has become since.
Yeah. So that's right. So the 2015 race was basically marred by, some kind of battle between organized crime groups where armed men entered the town of Urique, where the race is held, and reportedly kidnapped, took local men, one from the local police department. There was shooting, there was violence and killings. And all of this while a race was happening. So you can imagine what that meant for race organizers, especially race organizers, from the U.S. who hadn't necessarily had to deal with these types of, an outbreak of cartel violence. So I had heard about the 2015 race, and the 2015 race is certainly not in McDougall's book because that his book had come out in 2009. I believe I read a lot of reporting on it when it happened, And I thought, wow, this is a kind of another expression of this, this idea of what happens when Americans go into places that can be like a playground for a while, and what happens when something like this rears its ugly head. And that's something that John Sayles, has done a lot to, kind of interrogating that material, and so we knew that 2015 had happened, and then it was just a matter of finding out who the players in that moment had been, and so that's what led us to Josue Stevens and Maria Walton. And I have to say, everyone was very interested in communicating with us and sharing their part of the story, understanding that it would be put in a context where there would be kind of conflicting accounts. And I appreciated that about everyone who we interviewed, because they were all very kind of pretty wise to the power dynamics there, and having some ambivalence about the situation. And I think it's true of a lot of things in life. I don't envy the position of the organizers who had to worry about the safety of a group of international runners in the middle of a conflict. At the same time, you can understand how the local Mexican organizers felt like, who are these people who just kind of, literally fly in on Cessnas, organize this race, and then fly out when everything's gone, and we're stuck here kind of negotiating the tough stuff of the day-to-day. So to me, that just was the most interesting stuff, is where people are negotiating these kind of complicated relationships.
And where is the race now in its evolution? I'm assuming that it didn't happen in 2020, but.
So it didn't happen in 2020, but it did happen, in 2019 when we went and filmed, and it was actually a very big turnout. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it was very well attended. There were, again, international runners. And, it is a very impressive thing to see. Urique is a tiny little town. It kind of reminds me of these towns that gear up for like an annual festival, but people come in to sell their wares, and all the restaurants and hotels book up. It's a big deal for the town of Urique, and the local businesses are great, and it's an extraordinary race. I mean, it's 50 miles, it's 80 kilometers over incredibly hard terrain, up and down. We filmed it. I often filmed it on the back of an ATV. Shaking ATV on the edge of these ridges, and I was exhausted just sitting on this ATV chasing the runners. So it really is an incredible thing to see these runners compete in this way. So I know they're organizing current race organizers in the city of Urique are planning a race for 2020 and beyond. And I think there continues to be this goal of bringing in outsiders with an eye towards bringing resources into the area. And the reality is the area does need a tremendous amount of help. I mean, it has been neglected by the Mexican federal government for decades. So there is a very real need there. I think the question is just how best to support the people, and I don't think that anybody has an easy answer to that.
And is it the city that's running it now, or who's running it?
That's right. So it's the city of Urique that has now taken over the management of the race. So since the fallout that you see in the film in 2015, the city's taken over.
So we're pretty much out of time, but there was a line from Irma Chavez that really stuck with me, in which she said, "Running is our resistance to imposition. It's a big part of our identity and worldview." And so I just want to close by asking you, how did your work on this film change or inform your ideas of what running is and can be?
Yeah, I mean, again, I appreciate you highlighting that comment from her. I mean, I think Irma, to me, in the film represents one of the kind of more potent voices. She's just also a very kind of strong, compelling person. And I think to your question about, is there a way in which like a book like, Born to Run could be written in a different way? I think if the film does anything, I think it points towards that other possibility. And I'm not suggesting I be the author of that at all. On the contrary, what I think is that our job of documentary makers, like we're best, I think, when we're listening. And so I think we, what we try to do in the film is highlight Irma's voice, because she makes that point that there's maybe a romantic image that Born to Run put out about a very complex community in tough circumstances, but what she's maybe drilling down into kind of arguably the deeper meaning of what running is in the culture. And, I see a film like this as part of a continuum, like hopefully, someone will pick this thread up and make it into something better. But I do, that line is an important one because I feel like she's hinting at what it means for her, and not, relying on an outside author to tell her or the world about what the meaning of running is for her community.
Well, Bernardo, I want to thank you so much. It's been great listening to you today. And we really appreciate the myriad of voices that you've brought to us through The Infinite Race. I encourage all those in the audience to please spread the word about the film. And Bernardo, we can't wait to see what you have next. We love your work, and it's just great to talk to you today. Thank you so much.
It's great to talk to you, Ken, and I hope we get a chance to do it in person and hopefully over a cocktail.
Indeed. Take care.
Thank you, Ken.